People adopt different role models in life. Some pattern their lives after great athletes, others after brilliant philosophers or popular actors, musicians, or entrepreneurs. However, if I had to choose one man from history to pattern my life after, you wouldn't have read of him in history books, or visited a grand statue of him, or even heard of any great thing he had done. No, if I had to choose, I would choose the simple life of the rancher Jonathan Heaton. A man who lived a life full of hard work and sacrifice, and yet a man who was fiercely loyal, devoted to God and family, and above all, a man of integrity. He valued family and honor more than fame and great popularity, more than riches and treasures of this earth. I would want to become like this man, because when it all comes down to it, who you are is more important than anything else. This is the story of Jonathan Heaton.
Two scenes right from heaven keep me traveling this road. Work needs doing, that's how it's always gonna be. 'Cause Lucy's down at Moccasin, Amy's up at Wild Rose, and the family flows between 'em constantly. In spring they're lambing up and out and branding cattle on the strip, and the big house bursts with bottle in summer and fall. Winter sledding on the cowhide, the school caboose makes its trip, filled with laughing, singing children, large and small. How this treasury of memories accrue. If my life can be a pattern, may I recommend to you. You got to plow a straight furrow, cut a straight swath, rake a straight windrow till you're done. Look in your mirror every morning and night and ask, is this the man I want to become? Heaven blessed our shepherd's hands, and we got done before we should, so the blessings will be shared with all involved. It's my way of building Zion, turning hearts to the good, and it's the way all of our problems will get solved. If the wood's good and the blade is true, a straight cut's what you get, and if the wood cures well, then straight is how it stays. It's a recipe for living with no fears and regrets, and it's a metaphor for God's blessed ways. So come see what selfless charity does. We've got no halves in this family, only wholehearted love. You got to plow a straight furrow, cut a straight swath, rake a straight windrow till you're done. Look in your mirror every morning and night and ask, is this the man I want to become? Johnny cake and onions, scriptures and prayers, honey from the hive down from the geese, melons in the sand, spring when the whole family's there. It's like heaven on earth if you ask me. But you've got to plow a straight furrow, cut a straight swath, rake a straight windrow till you're done. Look in your mirror every morning and night and ask, is this the man I want to be? Looking back at me, is this the man I want to become?
Our story starts on January 17, 1857, when Jonathan Heaton was born to the new American immigrants Esther and William Heaton in a small cabin in Payson, Utah. At that time, the Ute Indians had erupted into war, and the town was under constant threat of attack. The days of the Black Hawk War were a fearful time for the Heatons, but through diligence and faith, they began to establish themselves. This wild, untamed country became a place of opportunity to William and Esther as they cleared their land and planted an orchard, gardens, and fields in the fertile soil. They had livestock for milk and meat, a grist mill close by to grind their wheat into flour, and wild game and fish from nearby canyons. Esther and William planned to live out the remainder of their lives in Payson, and Jonathan spent 11 years of his life growing up beneath the majestic Wasatch Mountains. But the Lord had different plans for this young family. In 1868, Brigham Young issued the call to settle the Muddy Mission, a remote desert part of southwestern Utah. It was a challenging prospect to again leave everything they had worked for and start over. But William was fortified as he was set apart for the new mission by President Young himself and promised the blessings of Abraham for his obedience. William and Esther left their comfortable home, loaded their wagon with bare essentials, and set out through the heart of Ute country with their 5 sons to begin a great new adventure. After 2 backbreaking years of battling the alkali desert, orchards were beginning to take hold, and the wheat was flourishing. It was finally starting to feel like a real home to the Mormon community. Then, the official government surveys put St. Joseph in Nevada instead of Utah, and Nevada demanded back taxes in U.S. silver and gold. When an appeal in court failed, President Young counseled the discouraged settlers to leave the state whose laws and burdens were so oppressive. With few exceptions, that is what the settlers opted to do. William Heaton raised his hand against the move. He said, "We were called to a mission, and I will stay until I am released." A letter came the next day closing the mission and releasing the missionaries. Upon advice from President Young, the work-worn settlers headed for southern Utah to a place called Long Valley. Compared to the desert of southern Utah, it must have looked like paradise to the desert-weary travelers. It would have been hard to find a group of people better prepared to live the United Order than the survivors of the Muddy Mission. And the newly established order moved just 4 miles up Long Valley, founding a brand new community they called Orderville, where everyone could be of one mind.
Every bit of property we owned was turned over to the order. Farms, livestock, and industries were to be operated for the good of all. The most interesting and exciting idea was the big kitchen and dining hall where we all ate together. 300 pounds of flour were made into bread every day, and one boiler held 3 bushels of potatoes all at once. What I loved most about the meals was that we really seemed like one big family. For us teenagers, it was exciting to be with our friends 3 times a day for meals. I found myself secretly watching for Jonathan Heaton to come to supper.
I was paid a man's wage of $1.50 per day when I was just 17 because I was supervising men older than me. But it wasn't all work. I thought the young people of the order had more fun than anywhere else around. We played games like Run Sheepy Run, baseball, and had molasses candy pulls and dances. Sleigh riding in the winter was also fun. We used to hitch a horse to a cowhide and go skimming over the snow.
Jonathan started walking me home after dances. Jonathan was handsome and had great physical strength from his work in the sawmill. My father admired him, as he was well respected for one so young. Even though I was just 15, I was in love with Jonathan. When he proposed, I said yes. Some of our friends thought I was awfully young to be married, but my father said, "You were old enough when you were big enough, and if you were big enough, then you were old enough."
Life in the order proved to be a great place to grow up, with plenty of activities to keep a young man busy. But as Jonathan matured, so did his interest in the young Clarissa Amy Hoyt.
Amy and I traveled with my mother and father to Salt Lake City, where we were married in the endowment house. Amy was beautiful in the wedding dress her mother and aunts made for her. We were carefree and young, and enjoyed our time together as we made a honeymoon out of a trip back to Orderville. Our first home was a wagon box set up next to Father's house. We soon moved to the sawmill to be closer to my assignment. Our first son, William, was born there. He was a handsome boy with a mop of dark hair and blue eyes. John was born soon after we moved to Grassy, where the order kept its dairies herd.
Jonathan and Amy made a beautiful couple, and they loved each other most tenderly. Within a few short years, they had a couple of healthy sons to look after. And although living in the United Order made living easier by splitting up the workload and sharing literally everything that they had with everyone else, sometimes the challenges of the heart weighed more than the challenges of honest toil. Amy gives us great insight into the life of the early Latter-day Saint women.
When some of the men in the order were called to take more wives, Jonathan was among them. I had lived in a home where polygamy was perfectly and beautifully lived, and I loved both my mothers. I felt it was something I would do. Although I had agreed to the calling, I have to admit it was hard for me to see Jonathan dress up and go to town without asking me to go when he began courting Lucy. And I was left at home with 2 little boys pulling at my skirts and demanding my attention. It was then that I learned to sing away my feelings of hurt and disappointment.
It's most common to see polygamy from the woman's perspective. After all, she is the one sharing her husband. But Jonathan provides a unique perspective into the life of an early Latter-day Saint husband and the attendant difficulties.
I was working on the farm at Grassy when I saw a small group of teams and wagons moving slowly over the valley. It was the Carroll family coming to join the order, and I saw Lucy for the first time. She was a lovely girl with soft blue eyes and light brown hair. I dreamed that night that I'd married Lucy and that we had had children in even numbers. Although Amy and I were united in this, I worried that I couldn't measure up to the responsibility of raising 2 families, and I could see how hard it was for Amy. Yet it felt right to both of us, and so I courted Lucy and married her in the St. George Temple. I was determined to keep a promise I had made to God as a young man that, if He would give me a family, I would do all I could to return them to Him clean and pure.
Although it was no longer required for the first wife to take the second one by the hand and give her to the husband in the wedding ceremony, I gave my full and willing consent just the same.
Despite the obvious difficulties it presented, Jonathan, Amy, and Lucy did remarkably well, and the years that followed made Lucy and Amy truly sisters, united in the cause of a large and busy family. They both were devoted to Jonathan, and in time to each other. The evidence of their success is found in their family. Between them, 26 children were born, and each felt great acceptance and love from both mothers. The family motto became, "No halves in this family." It cannot be disputed that together they fulfilled their calling to raise a righteous generation to the Lord. But they were just beginning to adjust to their new life together when Jonathan was called to move from the dairy farm at Grassy to the cotton farm in Dixie. The trip from Long Valley to the cotton farm was not a short one in those days of lumbering, heavily loaded wagons, but the 2-mile descent down the Hurricane Fault was by far the most dreaded part of the trail. On one of Jonathan's trips back to Dixie, while still quite a distance from the bottom, his brake block flew out and the horses, unable to hold the load, became frightened and ran away. But with a strong arm and steady nerve, he kept them on the road, narrow though it was, with its dangerous sharp curves, and landed at the bottom of the hill, right side up. Knowing his life had been spared, he stopped to give thanks to God, and then continued on his way. Jonathan worked hard to make the cotton farm a success for the United Order. Planting cotton was done with thousands of cuttings from nearby fields and watered by ditch from the Virgin River. Jonathan was the first one to successfully keep the irrigation water the whole season, as keeping a dam in the sandy Virgin River was extremely difficult. One flash flood could undo weeks of work.
Life wasn't all work at the farm. Friends and relatives from Orderville came to stay on their trips to St. George. Every year at cotton picking time, a group of young people from the order would be called to help in the fields. It was so hot, They would sleep on the cotton bales at night, and although they worked hard, everyone laughed and sang and had a good time. They added merriment to our days, and we were always sad to see them go.
On January 22nd, 1883, Jonathan recorded, "We sold the farm, getting 2 wagons, 1 span of horses, 20 cows, 5 steers, $700 in cash, 3 mares, and 2 colts. Now numbering 9, he moved his wives and children back to Orderville." Jonathan ran the sheep herd so profitably that they were divided into 6 herds to make the care of the 15,000 or so sheep manageable. Amy's daughter Hannah tells of an incident when the sheep were at risk.
Father and John Jr. were moving the sheep late one fall, and a blizzard struck without warning. The snow fell so fast and drifted so quickly that each animal was penned into a spot by itself. There seemed no way of saving the helpless animals. Father knelt down in the snow and asked the Lord for help. He said he had never seen the sun come out so fast or shine so hard as it did that day. The snow melted quickly, and the sheep were saved.
Despite the dedication of many of the members, the days of the United Order were coming to an end. The young people were looking at the livestock boom and the silver from the Silver Reef mine and began to desire property of their own. The original families were getting larger, and others that had come to join caused inequities. The deal breaker for the United Order, however, was the threat from the federal government to confiscate any church-owned property of at least $50,000 in value. Keeping the Long Valley property safe from the government was crucial, and so division was inevitable.
I felt badly about the breakup of the order, but my hopes were revived when my brothers and I received the moccasin property jointly and made plans to move forward in unity when we formed a company we called Heaton Brothers. We were also allowed to keep our Orderville home.
In 1887, news hit the Utah Territory that rocked it from top to bottom. The Edmunds-Tucker Act was signed into law. The Edmunds-Tucker Act prohibited the practice of polygamy and punished it with a fine of from $500 to $800 and imprisonment of up to 5 years. The act was enforced by the U.S. Marshal and a host of deputies. Polygamists were hunted, caught, tried, fined, and imprisoned in the territorial penitentiary. To avoid arrest, polygamists took to the underground, another town, travel, or a foreign mission. Some 1,300 men were jailed for their violations. The church vigorously defended itself in court and in the press. In a Deseret News article on April 1, 1879, Wilford Woodruff wrote,
"As an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, I will not desert my wives and children and disobey the commandments of God for the sake of accommodating the public clamor of a nation steeped in sin and ripened for the damnation of hell."
In 1890, Wilford Woodruff issued a manifesto prohibiting any further plural marriages. It was the end of an era. Federal deputies left, and normal life resumed for southern Utah. Fred and Wilford sold their interest in the Moccasin Ranch to Alvin and Jonathan, also ending the company. Jonathan's oldest sons were now grown and married when he and Alvin dissolved their partnership and divided the properties in Moccasin, Fiddler's Green, and Orderville. Lucy's oldest son, Charles, who had been living at Moccasin, working with Alvin, describes the difficulty of the separation.
Father announced that Uncle Alvin would keep Moccasin and we would go to the Green. There was no misunderstanding between the brothers. Love and unity existed at all times. Next morning, we got our wagons and teams and other things and left for the Green in Orderville. When we were about between Cedar Ridge and Blue Knolls, 5 or 6 miles from Moccasin, Uncle Alvin caught up with us on his horse. He and Father walked a short distance from the wagons and talked. I don't know what was said, but in about 30 minutes, they came back and told us that we would go back to the Moccasin, and Uncle Alvin would move to the Green. As Uncle Alvin thought that caring for Moccasin was too big a job for him and his family of girls. and that Father and all his boys could take better care of it. Again, there was perfect harmony, love, and devotion between the two brothers because they talked things out and understood each other perfectly.
In 1900, Jonathan purchased the Segmiller Ranch in Upper Kanab, and Amy and her family moved there permanently, and Jonathan began to develop the town site of Alton. Jonathan organized his family into a more unified way of life by forming a company called Heaton and Sons. This plan was accepted wholeheartedly, and the unity in finances and labor began to pay off as his sons began to work together for the good of the family.
Father often taught his children to work by pairing older siblings with younger ones to teach and supervise. When I was 6 years old, I spent the summer near Castle Ranch herding sheep with my big brother William. When I was about 8, I spent the summer at Strawberry herding sheep with my uncle, Fred Heaton.
I remember when I was young, in the fall, John and I would gather the cattle, the milk cows, and then drive them to Moccasin, where they'd winter.
A farmer's life involved a multitude of tasks, including building fences and weeding and fertilizing the garden. One seemingly simple chore of hauling fertilizer turned quickly into a life-threatening experience that ultimately tested Jonathan's faith.
Several of us children got on top of the load to ride to the field. The big corral gate had a long pole run across the top. It had a pole running across the bottom to keep pigs and lambs from crawling under. When the front wheels of the wagon ran over this pole, I started to slide down the load. I was scared, and that is the last I remember. They say the hind wheel of the wagon mashed my head flat, and they thought I was gone for sure. Uncle Jonathan took my head in his hands and between his knees, and with leg strength and arm strength, he pressed my head out round again. He pressed until he felt or heard the bones go back into place. Then they anointed me with olive oil and administered to me. How long it took me to regain consciousness and to get well, I do not know. I strongly believe that if several medical specialists had been taking care of me instead of Uncle Jonathan Heaton and the Lord, I wouldn't be here today.
Jonathan Heaton was a man of many gifts. The gift of healing was just one. His gifts of leadership and organization contributed greatly to the success of his large family, as well as business and community enterprises. Heaton and Sons tried many business ventures over the years, but none quite so ambitious as the 1909 purchase of the A.D. Findlay herd, consisting of 4,400 head of cattle, the Pipe Springs Fort, and all improvements and water rights. Jonathan added a small bar to the Findlay brand, creating the Old Pipe brand that marked all of the Heaton and Company cattle. These were the glory days of cattle on the Arizona Strip, and the Heaton brothers were right in the middle of it. Jonathan's children learned integrity from working with their father. He was known by those he associated with as an honest and generous man.
Son, if you plow a nice, straight furrow, people will judge you to be honorable and honest and straight in dealing with other people, and dependable in all things. But if you plow a crooked furrow, people will judge you to be dishonest and undependable and can't be trusted. Always plow a nice, straight furrow, rake a straight windrow, and cut a straight swath when cutting hay. I've tried to do that my whole life.
Education was a deep concern for the Heatons, and now that they were living in relative isolation at the Wild Rose and at Moccasin, the question of how to provide schooling for their children became paramount. Jonathan, with only 2 months of formal schooling in his youth, was determined that his children would not lack as he had, and he made sure that both of his homes had fine libraries.
When I moved to Moccasin for the last time, my 2 biggest concerns were the lack of schooling and missing the advantages of a fully organized ward for our children. But as always, we just did the best we could. For the first few years, we held school in my front room for the younger children as well as Sunday school. There was great excitement in 1907 when the Mojave County officials agreed to furnish materials for a schoolhouse if we would build it. Jonathan and the boys hauled the lumber from John Brown's sawmill on the Kaibab and built it just across the road from my house. Just one large room with lots of windows and a large potbelly stove to heat it. It was a dream come true for me, and I often moved the geraniums aside of my big bay window to watch my grandchildren play at recess.
I lived in Mother Lucy's home for months at a time for years, and can truthfully say she was as good to me as she was to her own children, as good to me as my own mother. One afternoon when she was mending shirts, she found she was short of patches that matched. So some of the shirts she mended with different colored material. When she had finished and held them up for inspection, she found that she had put the matching patches on her own son's shirt. Without hesitation, she ripped off the patches and reversed them, putting the matching patches on my shirt and the odd ones on her son's shirt.
Jonathan got into the habit of living at the Wild Rose in the summer and in Moccasin during the winter. He had a large barn in both places, with stalls for horses and corrals for livestock. In keeping with the family practice of living cooperatively, Lucy went to Alton for potatoes, grain, and flour, and Amy came to Moccasin for garden produce, fruit, and molasses, and, of course, Moccasin's famed watermelons. The children went back and forth between the two households as they were needed and felt loved and accepted equally in each. When the two wives visited each other's homes, they were warmly welcomed and were the most favored guest. Lucy kept geese that were plucked each spring for pillows and feather beds.
We would run the geese into a small pen. Then the mothers and big sisters would come with rawhide chairs. Each would have a feather sack and a safety pin to pin the sack on their apron after they sat down. A goose was caught for each picker. They would get hold of the goose's legs and wings, turn them on their back, and start picking with the free hand. There was quite a knack to the way you pulled on the feathers. Starting down by the tail of the goose, you would give a quick pull toward the head. The feathers came out real easy. But sometimes the geese just wouldn't cooperate.
Grandma had a feather bed. Most of the bed ticks were made of corn husks, but hers was goose feathers that she personally picked from her big white geese. Almost, I can see her now, putting on a big white apron and going out to pick the geese.
Moccasin had orchards that had been planted during the days of the United Order. Jonathan kept them up and replenished with new seedlings. These orchards provided many peaches, plums, apricots, along with apples and cherries. In the fall of the year, all of the Heaton women would descend upon Moccasin for a bottling marathon. It was a festive occasion with big family suppers in the big house, lots of visiting and recipe exchanges. Cartloads of the best melons cooled in the sand spring were eaten in the evening after the hard day's work, and the children headed for the reservoirs for a much-anticipated cool swim. Church historian Andrew Jensen once said to Lucy, "You are a true mother in Israel. Your family holds the unique position of being the only family in the church who makes and officers a whole ward." The Moccasin and Alton wards that emerged from the tiny Sunday schools held at home in the big house and the small schoolhouse at the Wild Rose were family affairs. Service to the church and others was unexpected in the Heaton family. Life was lived according to gospel principles, and all decisions were measured against spiritual laws.
When I was 17, I was called on a mission to Australia. Almost all of the people in Alton and the ranches came and raised $500 to help me on my way. Mother's cake was raffled off 3 times. I loved these good, generous people, and I hoped I'd be able to justify their faith in me. But I found that hard work and prayer made me a good missionary, just like it helped me in everything else I had done to that point, and I learned to love my mission.
When the bell on the granary rang, everyone came quickly to wash up. Nobody wanted to miss supper. Everyone knelt by their chairs for family prayer each morning and night, with everyone taking their turn. We gave thanks for our blessings and then asked a blessing on any family member in need, especially for the brothers who were serving missions. Sometimes we had Johnny cake, milk, onions, molasses, and butter for supper, but most of the time it was bread and milk. Dinner at noon was the big meal of the day, with potatoes and gravy, meat, vegetables, and fruit. Everything came from what we raised on the ranch.
Lucy and Amy had some knowledge of how to treat various injuries and ailments, and often stitched up wounds. Yet their greatest source of knowledge was inspiration.
Many a time I had no one to go to but the Lord, and He has always helped me out of a difficult situation. He has inspired me to do things in sickness that I had never thought of before. He never failed me. I kept a jar full of sterilized strips of cloth for wounds. There was turpentine for cut fingers and stubbed toes. We administered sulfur and molasses to all the children in the spring for a tonic. Bran in warm water was a sure cure for chappy hands, and feet were greased with warm mutton tallow.
I remember Lucy was often called upon to help the Indians, deliver babies, or help them when they were sick. Once a young Paiute mother brought her sick baby to Lucy. A bad cold had settled in its lungs. Lucy doctored it by making poultices for the baby until it was better.
The first tragedy that neither prayer nor medical help could prevent was in 1916, when our youngest son, Timothy, at the age of 13, was riding herd with the cattle when his horse fell on him. He wasn't one to complain, and so he continued to ride until his brothers could see he was in great pain. I nursed him constantly and prayerfully, but 5 months later he died. Jonathan gave a primrose to both me and Lucy to plant in Tim's memory. 4 years later, Mercy died suddenly from appendicitis in St. George, where she was attending Dixie High School. We didn't get there in time to say goodbye. We were grief-stricken by the loss.
Jonathan's family loved to get together, and reunions were often held.
1903 was a milestone for Grandma Amy. Not only was she 70, she also had 70 grandchildren. They were devoted to her. That year, Alton planned to choose a Miss Utah for the 24th of July celebration. One of the grandchildren felt that his Grandma Amy should be chosen to be Miss Utah because she had lived in Alton longer than the young girls who had been nominated. Jonathan and Amy's grandchildren went to work to sell votes. With all of the pennies of their own, plus the money they earned in donations, put Amy in the lead. Her white head bore the silver crown proudly. Everyone commented that she was the most beautiful Miss Utah they had ever seen.
A little slower now and white-haired, the three of them spent more time together. They made trips to Salt Lake in a one-seated car, and their enjoyment of each other's company was evident. Their children and grandchildren lived in so many places now, there was always someone to visit. They had emerged from the refiner's fire victorious, and in their golden years, they became one. At age 72, Jonathan could still put in a hard day's work to keep his homes and farms in good shape. The 1st of August in 1930, Jonathan was grading a road in Alton when the blade struck a large rock, throwing Jonathan out onto the machinery. He was badly injured and was taken to the hospital in Cedar City, but the internal injuries were too great. In the 5 days he lingered, Amy and Lucy were by his side, with all but one of his 23 living children coming to say goodbye. Lucy lived another 7 years, well cared for by her family in Moccasin. Her health declined, and sensing that the end was near, she called for all of her children and all of Amy's. She died at home in the big house on July 20th, 1937. Amy and the family buried her by Jonathan in Orderville. Amy, often lonely now, yearned for her family and began to travel to visit her children. She delighted in seeing new temples. She spent more time with her beloved grandchildren, telling them stories, always with a moral. As her health waned, she stayed with Hannah in St. George. Toward the end, the veil became very thin for Amy, and Hannah could hear her conversing with Jonathan, Lucy, Tim, and Mercy, and her parents. In a slow, faltering voice, Amy requested that they tell the family goodbye and to be good for my sake. Tell the grandchildren goodbye and that Grandma loves every one of them. Then added, "Oh God, all-wise Father, help us all to prove faithful to the end. I am leaving you tonight." She passed away on that day, April 21st, 1943, rejoining Jonathan and Lucy. An extraordinary era had come to an end. Jonathan, Amy, and Lucy left a great legacy. Although little known outside the small part of the world in which they lived out their lives, how they lived continues to influence their descendants, which now number over 14,000. Those descendants can now be found all over the world. The legacy they left of unselfishness, of deep loyalty to family and God, hard work, unity and initiative, service, missionary work and gathering, influence and bind us as a family today. Jonathan's motto of "no halves in this family" was something keenly felt by each family member. They were proud of it, and they lived it. Through them, we see the possibility of enduring well. We see the blessings of faithfully lived lives. It's a remarkable endowment to us, their posterity.
Two scenes right from heaven keep me traveling this road. Work needs doing, that's how it's always gonna be. 'Cause Lucy's down at Moccasin, Amy's up at Wild Rose, and the family flows between 'em constantly. In spring they're lambing up in Alton, branding cattle on the strip, and the big house bursts with bottle in summer and fall. Winter sledding on the cowhide, the school caboose makes its trip, filled with laughing, singing children, large and small. How this treasury of memories accrue. If my life can be a pattern, may I recommend to you. You got to plow a straight furrow, cut a straight swath, rake a straight windrow till you're done. Look in your mirror every morning and night and ask, is this the man I want to become? Heaven blessed our shepherd's hands, and we got done before we should, so the blessings will be shared with all involved. It's my way of building Zion, turning hearts to the good, and it's the way all of our problems will get solved. If the wood's good and the blade is true, a straight cut's what you get, and if the wood cures well, then straight is how it stays. It's a recipe for living with no fears and regrets, and it's a metaphor for God's blessed ways. So come see what selfless charity does. We've got no halves in this family, only wholehearted love. You got to plow a straight furrow, cut a straight swath, rake a straight windrow till you're done. Look in your mirror every morning and night and ask, is this the man I want to become? in the sand, spring when the whole family's there. It's like